Get out of here and wait outside. You have no reason to be here. That voice sliced through the afternoon air like a blade, cold, contemptuous, and dripping with authority. The receptionist shouted, "I'll call security if you don't leave right now. People like you don't fly on flights like this." Kiana Brooks froze. The silence that followed seemed to swallow the entire airport. Rain began to tap against the runway at Westchester County Airport. And in that very moment, Kiana, a black female billionaire, stood face to face with an employee who had absolutely no idea she was yelling at the owner of the entire company. What she did not realize was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. In just a few minutes, the very people who had shouted her out the door would be confronted with the most painful truth of their careers. They hadn't just insulted a passenger. They had insulted the person who held the power to decide the future of every one of them. And by the time they realized it, it would be far too late to turn back. Before we dive into the astonishing story behind those rain-streaked glass doors, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching this video from. And if you believe that respect, whether in an airport or anywhere else, always deserves to be protected, hit like to help spread this message and subscribe to stay with us for the stories to come. That afternoon, the sky over Westchester hung like a thick gray blanket, warning of an approaching storm. Kiana stepped out of a sleek black Mercedes, the heels of her luxury shoes touching the damp concrete, still slick with rain, after just closing a multi-billion-dollar deal in London. All she wanted was a few quiet minutes in the premium lounge before boarding her private flight home. But the moment Kiana approached the first-class lounge entrance, Jason Miller, the lounge manager, spoke up with blatant suspicion. "Sorry, ma'am. This lounge is for first-class passengers only. Please provide your boarding pass and membership card so I can verify them." Kiana raised an eyebrow at his challenging tone. For more than 10 years, she had come here without any issues, especially during off-peak hours to avoid attention. Not wanting to argue, she retrieved her platinum card and boarding pass from her clutch and handed them to him. Jason took them, frowned, and held the card under the light as if examining counterfeit goods. He sighed loudly, making sure those nearby could hear. "Looks odd. I've never seen this type of card before. Are you sure you belong here?" Kiana kept her voice steady. "I'm sure. The card is fully valid." "Fine," Jason replied coldly. "But you'll have to wait out here while I verify it. We have to protect the privacy and comfort of our premium guests." Kiana felt the implication in his words, but she stepped back without saying more. The moment she turned away, Jason's demeanor changed instantly as he spotted an older white man approaching. His expression softened completely. "Hello, Mr. Patterson. Your flight is boarding soon. Please come in." The man was waved in without showing a single document. Outside, Kiana watched everything, her chest tightening with quiet disappointment and simmering anger. The rain had grown heavier, chilling her through her elegant coat. One white passenger after another walked by, greeted warmly, while Kiana was treated like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. 25 minutes passed before Jason finally stepped out. His eyes still held suspicion as he spoke, his tone irritated and slightly reluctant. "All right, I'll let you in because the rain is heavy, but we'll be keeping an eye on you." Those words cut through Kiana's pride like shards of glass. She, the CEO of an entire aviation corporation, the one paying the salaries of every person in this building, was being humiliated in a space that belonged to her simply because her skin did not match their idea of what a VIP should look like. Kiana stepped into the lounge, her coat dampened by the rain droplets clinging to her hair. The warm golden lights from the chandeliers illuminated her face, but they couldn't melt the cold settling deep inside her. She did not respond. She did not show anger, but her eyes had changed. Today she decided she would let them expose their own true nature before she personally swept out the toxic culture festering inside the company she had poured her life into. What they didn't know was that everything had only just begun. When Kiana stepped through the glass doors, The warmth of the premium lounge wrapped around her in the soft golden glow of the crystal chandeliers. The contrast between the cozy interior and the cold rain outside should have brought comfort, but for Kiana, it only made the invisible cut inside her feel sharper. Jason Miller followed behind, his eyes glued to her as though she had brought something suspicious with her. He said nothing, but every movement radiated caution. As they neared the reception counter, he tilted his head toward a young female employee beside him, lowering his voice, but still loud enough for Kiana to hear clearly. "Keep an eye on her. If anything seems off, tell me immediately." The employee nodded, hesitation flickering across her face. She didn't look directly at Kiana, only stole a quick glance before turning away, as if afraid to be caught in something she shouldn't be part of. In that brief look, Kiana saw the uncertainty of someone who sensed something was wrong, but lacked the position to speak up. She chose a seat in the corner of the room, leaning back against the smooth dark brown leather. Everything in the lounge was refined by first-class standards, from the faint hint of wood scent to the gentle murmur of jazz music drifting through the space. But one glance at the staff's darting eyes told her she wasn't truly welcome here. No one in the lounge knew who she was. No one knew the name Brooks on the boarding pass examined under the lamp was the very same Brooks printed across countless executive documents of the company. All they saw was a black woman alone entering a space they did not subconsciously consider meant for her. Jason returned to the counter, his gaze still tracking her movements. He opened the computer, typed a few lines, and checked the information on the screen. Right next to K. Brooks was the label Owner CEO, but he skimmed past it quickly, as though his mind refused to accept such a possibility. In his 10 years of work, Jason believed he had a talent for spotting real guests, people he thought belonged in spaces like this. To him, they were usually middle-aged white men in tailored suits with the quiet arrogance of old money. A black woman sitting silently in a corner did not fit his template. Farther across the room, a young employee named Mia Collins glanced toward Kiana. Her eyes were filled with confusion and a touch of guilt. Mia had witnessed everything, Kiana being told to stand in the rain, her documents scrutinized like contraband, and being informed she would be monitored. But like many new staff members, Mia didn't feel confident enough to interfere. Her silence weighed heavier on her each time their eyes met. Kiana felt the atmosphere in the room. Every sideways glance felt like an unspoken whisper, but she didn't show any reaction. Her calm wasn't a mask. It was the choice of someone who had learned to meet contempt with unshakable steadiness. And she knew this wasn't just a small incident. It was a microcosm of a much larger problem, one that had seeped into the very company she had built from the ground up. Jason suddenly approached her again. His expression tightened, as though bracing himself to handle something dangerous. "I want to make this clear," he said, his voice low and sharp. "If you display any disruptive or suspicious behavior, I will have to call security." Kiana looked straight at him. Her gaze wasn't challenging, nor was it apologetic. It simply held a quiet truth. She knew exactly what was happening. "Do you say this to every guest?" she asked softly. "Or only to people who look like me?" For a split second, Jason froze. But like most people convinced of their own correctness, he quickly reconstructed his composure. "I say it to anyone I feel it's necessary for." He walked away, leaving the question hanging in the air. Kiana felt the wound not only on her personal dignity, but on the institution she had poured her heart into. Today she wasn't confronting the rudeness of a single employee. She was confronting the consequence of a culture she hadn't realized had kept so many shadows within it. The rain outside continued to lash against the glass, each wave threatening to shatter the lounge's artificial calm. Kiana sat still, her eyes quietly following the movements in the room, while inside her a resolve was forming clearer with every breath. The real storm, not the one outside, was drawing near. And when it hit, nothing inside Brooks Aviation would ever be the same again. After sitting quietly for a few more minutes in the lounge, Kiana stood up, adjusting the coat that still held droplets of rain on her shoulders. No one seemed to notice her movement, except Mia Collins, who continued to watch Kiana's every action With a worried gaze, she tried to hide. Each time Kiana walked beneath the warm golden lights, Mia felt a sting of guilt for the silence Kiana was being forced to endure. Kiana didn't stop at the reception desk or look back. She walked straight toward the door leading down to the tarmac, where her private flight was waiting. The cold air rushed in when the door opened, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and the lingering moisture from the storm that had just swept through. On the runway, the gleaming white Gulf Stream sat still like a sharp contour against the gray sky. The taxiway lights reflected along its fuselage in long bands of light, and the staircase leading up to the cabin was partially shielded by a thin canopy still holding traces of the wind's chill. As Kiana approached the base of the stairs, a neatly dressed flight attendant was already waiting Emma Roberts. Emma's eyes swept over Kiana from head to toe in a single glance, and the faint curl of disdain at the corner of her lips barely managed to hide itself. Kiana reached for her documents, but Emma lifted a hand to stop her. "Sorry," she said with a tone that suggested the opposite. "This is a private aircraft. You're not allowed to board." Kiana paused, not out of surprise, but because the look in Emma's eyes was disturbingly similar to Jason's just minutes earlier. The absurdity was becoming painfully logical, the result of a culture so ingrained that none of them realized what they were doing anymore. "I know it's a private aircraft." Kiana's voice was calm, soft, but weighted. "I have the documents for this flight." Emma crossed her arms, maintaining her skeptical stare. "The issue isn't paperwork. You just don't resemble the kind of passengers we serve on this flight. If you're lost, the commercial terminal is on the other side about a mile away." The runway seemed to grow even quieter after that sentence. Kiana felt the wind hit her face, but the cold wasn't from the weather. It came from Emma's words delivered with full confidence that she was right. Kiana held out her boarding pass, but Emma didn't bother to look. "This flight isn't cheap." Emma continued, her tone flat, as if she were stating an obvious fact. "A journey like this costs at least $75,000. And usually people, like you, don't pay for that." A few nearby ground crew workers hesitated, their eyes flicking toward the scene for a brief second, before quickly turning away. No one wanted to step in. No one wanted to challenge Emma, who was known for her rigidity. In the cockpit just a few steps away, Captain Richard Davis glanced through the window. He had served Brooks Aviation for many years, but he had never seen anyone blocked from boarding a private jet like this. Davis looked at Kiana's face, then at Emma's posture, and a faint suspicion began to grow inside him. Emma lifted her radio. "Security. Someone is trying to board the wrong aircraft. I need assistance." Jason Miller, hearing the signal from the lounge, rushed over immediately. Rain darkened his shoulders, but he maintained the same confident tone as he approached. "We already asked you to leave this area. This is a restricted zone. You need to leave immediately." "I'm a passenger on this flight," Kiana said, her voice steady, as if she were stating something painfully obvious. "No," Emma replied, cutting her off as though everything Kiana said was meaningless. "I've worked here long enough to know what our passengers look like, and you are not one of them." In that moment, the sound of rain hitting the metal canopy above rang louder than any voice. Each drop emphasized that this world still had places where achievements, wealth, or status were not enough to change the way people saw a black woman standing alone before a luxury aircraft. Kiana looked at Emma, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a deep disappointment, silent and still like the surface of water before a storm. "Are you sure?" she asked. Emma lifted her chin, as though her certainty would end all debate. "I'm absolutely sure." It was the kind of moment where someone else might have turned around and walked away. But Kiana simply slid her hand into her coat pocket, touching the phone she had kept on silent. The sky above Westchester darkened, and in an instant, Kiana knew everything was about to change direction. In the steady rhythm of rain hitting the metal canopy, Kiana raised her hand and touched the phone that had remained silent since she stepped into the airport. Her movement was calm, so calm in fact that it made everyone around her pause instinctively, as if they could sense something in the air shifting. Emma stayed planted in front of the stairway, her body angled forward like a living barricade. Jason stood right behind her, exhaling sharply, the way someone does when they believe they are fulfilling their duty, even though the thin streak of worry in his eyes betrayed him. Neither of them looked away from Kiana. When she brought the phone to her ear, her voice did not shake, did not rise, and carried no hint of urgency. It was low, soft, but razor-sharp, the voice of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. "Lauren," she said, "connect me to Ethan immediately. I need an emergency meeting with the entire executive board." The silence that followed stretched longer than usual, as if each syllable had landed on the wet pavement and sent ripples through it. Emma frowned, unsure of what she had just heard. But her instinct for confrontation pushed her to hold her ground. "What do you think you're doing?" Emma asked, her tone dropping. "Who exactly do you think is going to answer your call? We already told you you have no right to be here." Jason folded his arms across his chest. "She's stalling," he said. "We should escort her out of this area immediately." But the moment he finished speaking, Ethan Bennett's voice came through the phone, slicing the atmosphere clean in two. "Kiana, are you okay? What's happening at Westchester?" The name Bennett hit Emma like a tightening rope around her chest. She glanced at Jason, but the confidence on his face had already begun to dissolve. Kiana kept the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving the two people standing before her. "I'm being blocked from boarding my own aircraft," she said, her voice steady and even. "Our employees are telling me I'm not qualified to step onto the private jet that I own." There was a pause on the other end. Just 1 second, but enough for both Emma and Jason to feel the weight of that silence. Kiana Ethan said, his tone sharpening. "I'm on my way. The legal team and security detail are coming with me. No one is to leave that area." Kiana gave a slight nod, not for anyone to see, but to acknowledge what she already knew. Everything was now moving exactly where it needed to go. She ended the call. No threats. No dramatic declarations. Just a soft tap to disconnect. Yet somehow it made Emma and Jason feel their mistake closing in on them at alarming speed. "Who do you think you're fooling?" Emma spoke up, though her voice no longer carried its earlier strength. "You called someone and think we'll suddenly believe you have authority here," Jason interjected, trying to reclaim control. "This is a Brooks Aviation aircraft. No one boards unless I authorize it." Kiana looked at them in silence. And it wasn't a defensive silence, nor was it angry. It was the silence of someone watching fractures spread across glass, knowing that one small pressure would shatter the whole pane. "Are you sure about that, Jason?" she asked softly. "Are you sure you understand who actually has the authority to decide that?" The question, simple as it was, hit Jason's wavering confidence hard. He opened his mouth to respond, but a burst of wind swept through, carrying the sound of approaching security vehicles. The glow of their warning lights reflected off the aircraft's fuselage, washing across Emma's and Jason's faces. Blue and red beams intertwined like they were exposing the truth the two had tried to suppress from the very beginning. Emma turned instinctively, and in that brief moment, her earlier firmness evaporated completely. What replaced it was a single, undeniable realization: something enormous was about to unfold, and she no longer had the power to stop it. Kiana stood where she was, her long coat swaying gently in the wind, her eyes no longer filled with disappointment, but with readiness. She knew that what was coming wouldn't merely resolve a small confrontation. It would strike at the very roots of a culture she had spent her life building. A storm was approaching, and this time it wasn't coming from the sky. The security sirens faded as two black SUVs slid to a stop near the private aircraft zone. Under the glow of lights reflecting off the rain-slick pavement, the Brooks Aviation security team moved quickly toward the stairway, efficient, disciplined, and calm. No shouting, no rushing. But their presence alone shifted the atmosphere in a way everyone could feel, as if the air had gained weight in just a few breaths. Emma and Jason stood frozen, trying to maintain composure, though the stiffness in their shoulders betrayed them. Jason stole another glance at Kiana, hoping her expression might give him an answer, anything that would reassure him he hadn't actually made a catastrophic mistake. But Kiana simply observed her gaze still and quiet, like a surface of water moments before it reflects the truth. Up on the Gulfstream stairs, Captain Richard Davis remained halfway down, one hand gripping the metal rail. His eyes moved across the group below, then settled on Kiana's face. On the tablet in his hand, the same line of text glowed clearly, unmistakably. K. Brooks, owner, CEO. Davis stared at those words again, as if confirming he wasn't misreading them. Then he lifted his head, feeling something sink inside him, not from the revelation itself, but from the shame of his own silence during the past several minutes. "Oh my God," he murmured, just loud enough for his first officer to hear. Tyler Evans glanced over, and when he saw the text on the screen, the color drained from his face. "It's really her?" Tyler asked, unable to hide his shock. Davis didn't respond immediately. He only nodded slowly, heavily, carrying the weight of too late realization. Below, Emma still blocked the stairway, but the rigidity in her posture had already begun to crumble. When she noticed Captain Davis descending with an unfamiliar urgency on his face, she frowned, confused. "Captain, what are you doing?" Emma asked, trying to sound normal. Davis didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, tilting the tablet just enough for Emma to see the screen. Light from the aircraft's nose reflected across her features as she leaned in. And within a single breath, Emma's expression transformed completely. Confidence gone. Suspicion gone. Only raw, unfiltered panic remained. "No, that can't," she whispered, her voice cracking as if squeezed from her throat. Jason, peering over her shoulder, saw the words too. In an instant, everything he had relied on, his tiny sense of authority, his blind certainty, his misguided intuition, fell apart like pieces of wet paper. Kiana still stood where she had been, her coat brushing softly in the wind. She hadn't said a word yet. Her silence seemed to demand an answer from them, even though none of them had one left to give. "You—" Emma attempted, but her voice trembled so much she could barely produce sound. "You're—" "That's enough, Emma." Captain Davis set his tone firm for the first time that afternoon. "Don't finish that sentence. The truth is right in front of us." Jason stepped back, unsure where to look. He had once been so sure of his ability to spot a first-class guest, but now all that remained was humiliation laced with fear. Wind swept across the runway carrying mist, and the sharp smell of jet fuel forming a thin haze between them. Through that haze, Kiana stood tall, calm, but not cold, like someone waiting to see whether those in front of her truly understood the magnitude of what they had done. "We've mistreated the CEO of this company," Davis said, his eyes fixed on Emma and Jason. "And we allowed it to happen at the door of her own aircraft." Emma lowered her head. Jason clenched his hands tightly, trying to stop them from trembling. No one spoke, but the silence itself roared louder than any apology could. Kiana tilted her head slightly, as though weighing her next move. She knew the real confrontation hadn't begun yet. Everything so far was just the first ripple, and the waves would spread far wider than anyone here imagined. In the distance, the blue and red lights of the incoming convoy glowed brighter, reflecting on the wet pavement in long, wavering streaks. She straightened her posture, her eyes fixed on the vehicles pulling to a stop. Not to threaten anyone, but to ready herself for what she knew would change everything that had ever happened at Brooks Aviation. Something none of them could avoid now. The black SUVs rolled to a stop at the edge of the runway, their tires leaving long streaks of water across the rain-soaked concrete. The doors opened and Ethan Bennett stepped out first. His face tightened in a way few people had ever seen from the usually composed COO. Behind him came the legal team, internal security, and two senior company managers. No one rushed, but their footsteps carried a gravity so palpable that Emma and Jason felt themselves instinctively leaning back, as if the weight of the moment alone was pushing them away. Wind swept across the runway, tugging at the hem of Kiana's coat. She remained still, no longer sparing a glance for Emma or Jason, instead fixing her eyes on Ethan as he approached. The runway lights blinked weakly, casting blue-red reflections across her face, an eerie contrast between her outward calm and the storm forming inside her. Ethan stopped in front of Kiana. The headlights behind them illuminated his expression more clearly, and in his eyes worry shone unmistakably. "Kiana," he said softly, his voice lowering so only the two of them could hear. "Are you all right?" Kiana took a slow breath. "I'm fine." But those two words carried layers of meaning that needed no explanation. Ethan understood immediately. He turned toward the employees blocking the aircraft stairs. His gaze landed on Emma first, and when it did, Emma felt her knees weaken slightly beneath her. "What exactly is happening here?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping into a tone that gave every syllable weight. Emma opened her mouth, but her voice came out rough. "Sir, I was only performing my duties. This woman. Ethan repeated each word colored with disbelief, "is the CEO of the company you represent, and you stopped her at the steps of the aircraft she owns." Emma's body stiffened. Her hands tightened, but she couldn't form a justification that made any sense. Jason stood beside her trying to look steady, yet fear revealed itself in the subtle tremor of his breathing. Ethan turned to him. "Do you know how long my sister had to stand in the rain outside the lounge?" Jason drew in a breath, but his voice still shook when he answered. I was only verifying her documentation, sir. I didn't know." "If you don't know who the CEO is," Ethan cut in sharply, "then who exactly qualifies for your respect?" Silence fell abruptly, stronger than the rain still falling around them. Captain Davis stepped forward, the tablet still in his hands. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "I've reviewed the manifest again. This was our mistake. I should have intervened sooner." Ethan looked at him for a moment, but instead of reprimanding him, he gave a small, measured nod. "Thank you for confirming it." A stretch of stillness settled over the group gathered at the aircraft stairs, long enough for everyone involved to confront the reality of their actions. The rain lightened, leaving only a mist that clung to jackets and hair. Kiana watched not with anger, but with the recognition that she was not witnessing a single employee's failure, but the symptom of a cultural problem that had grown silently within the very company she built. Ethan turned back to his sister. "We're handling this immediately," he said. "All of it. Nothing gets overlooked." Kiana didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. She knew what was unfolding was no mere confrontation between executives and staff. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that no employee at the Westchester Airport could yet fully comprehend. In the distance, the aircraft engines warming up rumbled through the air, merging with the remaining wind and rain. No one moved. Everyone seemed to be bracing for what would come next, even if none of them dared voice it. A new chapter in this confrontation had begun, and it was nowhere near its end. For several seconds, no one spoke. The runway stretched beneath the heavy sky rainwater, reflecting the faint purple and blue glow of the taxiway lights. The silence wasn't the quiet before a storm, it was the quiet after. People realize the storm has already hit, and they are standing directly at its center. Ethan looked around, taking in the faces of everyone present. Not one person retained the confidence they'd held earlier. Emma stood slightly hunched, her shoulders drooping, her hair blown to one side by the wind, exposing a face drained of color. Jason stood behind her, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned stark white. "We need to hear everything," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "From the beginning." Emma blinked once, then twice, as if searching for a justification that made sense, but every thought dissolved the moment she met Kiana's eyes. "Sir," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "I thought she wasn't an eligible passenger. I thought she didn't fit the type of people we serve." The words "didn't fit" cracked through the air, heavy and damning, as though even their sound understood they could no longer hide behind vague reasoning. Kiana did not react. She simply watched Emma with a calmness so unshakable that Emma felt herself shrinking, as if standing before a mirror she could no longer look away from. Based on what Ethan asked. Emma inhaled sharply. "Experience," she whispered. "And my intuition." Jason stepped in, struggling to hold his voice steady. I was only following protocol. I felt it was necessary to verify. By making the CEO of the company stand in the rain for nearly half an hour. Ethan asked, locking eyes with him. Jason lowered his head, pressing his lips together tightly. Captain Davis stood slightly off to the side, but his gaze never left Kiana. He looked like a man trying to understand how he had failed to sense the imbalance in his staff's behavior before things escalated. Tyler Evans remained beside him, still stunned by the sight of Kiana's name on the manifest. A cold gust swept across the runway, making several people flinch. But Kiana stood unmoved, no adjusting her collar, no shielding herself from the wind. It was as if the cold no longer touched her. Ethan turned back to his sister, his tone gentler. Do you want to proceed with the flight now, or deal with this immediately? A simple question with a meaning far deeper. The choice was hers. Not because she was CEO, but because she was the only one here who had endured humiliation in silence from beginning to end. Kiana glanced briefly at Emma and Jason before answering. Her gaze did not accuse, nor did it pardon. It simply reflected the truth. What happened today was not a small mistake, but the product of a culture that had gone unchecked for far too long. This needs to be addressed. Kiana said, her voice quiet but firm. Not after the flight. Right now. Ethan nodded. He turned to the legal team, and instantly one of them opened a tablet, preparing to document every detail. No raised voices, no intimidation. They simply worked, but the silence in how they worked made Emma and Jason tremble even more. Ms. Collins. Ethan called. Mia flinched slightly. She had been standing nearby the whole time, afraid to step forward, afraid to be dragged into something bigger than her. But Ethan's eyes weren't accusing, they were requesting the truth. You witnessed everything from the beginning. Please tell us what you saw. Mia hesitated, then stepped closer. Her expression revealed the conflict inside her, the fear of speaking against colleagues, and the responsibility she felt as someone who had seen wrongdoing but failed to intervene. Sir, she said softly but clearly, everything started when Ms. Brooks entered the lounge. And she swallowed hard. And they treated her like she didn't belong there. Her words were simple, but they were enough to paint the entire picture. Ethan looked back at Kiana. He understood what she was thinking. He understood that this was no isolated incident at an airport. It was a window, a glimpse into something that had been festering inside Brooks Aviation for years. A stronger gust swept across the tarmac, dragging droplets into long streaks across the ground. No one moved. No one stepped away. Kiana inhaled slowly, her gaze sweeping across the employees gathered before her. We begin here, she said. And with that single sentence, she officially opened the door to the largest cultural reckoning Brooks Aviation had ever faced. The door of the Gulfstream opened, revealing a quiet, softly lit cabin, an interior that looked as though it belonged to a different world entirely from the storm raging outside. As the group stepped in, the only sound was the muted thud of shoes against polished wooden flooring. Kiana entered first. She didn't look around, didn't search for validation, didn't express the slightest flicker of emotion. Yet that very silence pulled everyone behind her into a gravity so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Ethan stood to her right, the legal team to her left. Emma and Jason had no assigned positions, but instinctively they placed themselves together slightly back, noticeably away from the conference table, as if distance alone could soften the responsibility weighing on them. We'll begin, Ethan said. The company's attorney placed a tablet on the table. Its screen glowed a muted blue as he opened a file security footage lounge, audio logs, clips of Jason saying, "Not up to our standards," and Emma calling security. Ethan rotated the screen so they could all see. This is what happened. He said, his tone flat, almost quiet, but that quietness made the words hit harder. The footage played, unedited, unembellished. Just the raw truth. Jason's suspicious stare. Emma's tightening jaw when she assumed the wrong identity for a customer. The glaring contrast between how they welcomed Mr. Patterson versus how they treated Kiana. Jason swallowed. It was a tiny sound, but in the silence of the cabin, it echoed like a blow. Emma tried to hold her expression steady, but her shoulders twitched when the camera showed Kiana standing in the rain for more than 20 minutes. No one asked, "Why did you do that?" No one said, "Explain yourself." There was only the footage, undeniable, unfiltered, and unforgiving. Kiana remained still, one hand resting gently on the table's edge. Her gaze was on the screen, yet not fixated. She watched like someone already familiar with the events, someone who had lived through them and now viewed them from a distance that was somehow both personal and detached. "When I watch this," Ethan said slowly, "what concerns me isn't the actions themselves, it's the confidence behind them." No one responded. "You didn't question yourselves even once," he continued. "No hesitation, no second guess, not a single moment where you considered the possibility that you might be wrong." Jason inhaled a trembling breath. Emma lowered her eyes as if meeting anyone's gaze might make the truth even heavier. Kiana took one step toward them. Just one. But it shifted the air in the cabin like a change in pressure before a storm. "When I stood out there," she said softly, "I wasn't angry. Not at first. I simply thought, so this is how my company operates when I'm not present." She paused, letting the words settle, letting them land on each person like rain on metal. And that she continued hurt more than any insult. No one moved. Captain Davis stood near the aisle, his eyes drifting toward the window, his hands flexing and tightening at his sides, as if grappling silently with his own culpability. "My job," Kiana said, "isn't to instill fear. It's to ensure everyone in this system understands something fundamental. Your attitude doesn't just affect a customer. It affects the reputation of an entire corporation, the culture we build, and today, it impacted the integrity of this company." Emma lifted her head a fraction, just enough to suggest she wanted to speak, but no words came. Ethan glanced at the legal team. "Note in the record this incident stemmed from bias, not procedure." A lawyer typed quickly. Jason closed his eyes for a brief moment. The word bias was no longer a descriptor. It was evidence. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "We will make disciplinary decisions after this session concludes. But before we do that, one thing needs to be said, and only one person here has the authority to say it." He turned to Kiana. "She's the only one who can close this part." Kiana took a quiet breath, then faced Emma and Jason directly. Her gaze wasn't accusatory, but something in its calmness made it hard for them to keep standing. "What disappoints me," she said, "is not that you didn't recognize me. It's that you didn't recognize a human being." The cabin fell so silent that the tapping of rain on the aircraft's fuselage sounded deafening. And when Kiana spoke again, her voice didn't rise, but it carried farther than any shout ever could. "That is why we're here." Outside on the runway, the rain had eased slightly, but inside the aircraft cabin, the air grew heavier by the second. No one spoke after Kiana's final words. It was that stretched, suffocating silence, the kind that settles in only when everyone realizes there is no excuse left to reach for. Kiana stood before the small conference table, one hand resting lightly on its surface as if anchoring her breath. She did not show anger. She did not show triumph. The way she stood calm upright, her eyes clear, yet shadowed with disappointment, made the two people in front of her feel themselves shrinking with every passing moment. At last, Emma broke the silence. "Ms. Brooks, I truly didn't think." Kiana lifted her gaze, nothing more. And the unfinished sentence fell apart on its own. Emma pressed her lips together, trying to continue, but her voice trembled like it might shatter mid-air. "I thought I was following protocol. I thought I was protecting the quality of our service by excluding human beings." Kiana replied, her tone soft, almost too soft. One simple sentence, yet in the stillness of the cabin, it rippled like a stone dropped into a still lake. Jason lowered his head. Emma couldn't find a single spot to rest her eyes. Ethan stood with his arms crossed at the far end of the table. He didn't intervene, didn't soften the moment, didn't rescue anyone. He simply observed, because this wasn't a confrontation anymore, but a mirror they all had to look into. Jason stepped forward, half a step, voice small but steady. "I was wrong, ma'am. But I didn't mean to offend. I didn't know you were Kiana." Cut him off with a slow shake of her head. "You don't need to know who I am to treat me correctly." Jason froze as if that single line had knocked down the last wall he'd been clinging to. "Record that verbatim," Ethan said. The soft tapping of keys echoed from the legal team's tablet. Emma flinched at the sound. She turned toward Kiana, panic sharpening her voice. "Ms. Brooks, please. I can explain more." Kiana looked at her for a long moment. Not with the eyes of a superior addressing an employee, nor the eyes of a victim toward someone who wronged her. It was the gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime walking through doubt and prejudice. Yet this time, that prejudice came from inside the very company she built. "You don't need to explain further," Kiana said. "I stood outside the glass door for 25 minutes, listening to all the explanations already." Emma's fingers curled into her palms so tightly, her nails left marks. The professional confidence she always carried, so polished, so habitual, had crumbled into pieces somewhere between the rain outside and the unwavering clarity in Kiana's eyes. Captain Davis stepped forward slightly, as if wanting to speak. But when he saw Kiana's expression, not accusatory, but painfully honest, he bowed his head instead. "I should have stepped in sooner," he said quietly. "I knew something wasn't right, but I did nothing." "You chose silence," Kiana replied. "And sometimes, silence causes more harm than words." Davis closed his eyes briefly. Not to avoid responsibility, but like a man acknowledging a truth he had long known, yet never dared voice. Inside the small cabin, the truth wasn't a weapon. It was a light. It didn't pierce anyone. It simply revealed what had always been there. Ethan scanned the room, then asked Kiana, "Do you want to proceed with the decision now, or wait for additional information from security?" Kiana didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the cabin window, looking out at the runway. Raindrops still clung to the glass, stretching the airport lights into wavering streaks. Her flight had been delayed long enough. But she knew what she needed to do today mattered more than any meeting waiting elsewhere. "We'll end this here," she said. She turned back, eyes steady, unwavering. "What needed to be said has been said. What needed to be proven, the cameras have already proven." Emma looked away, covering part of her face with her hand, as if the shame was coming too fast for her to keep up. Jason stood motionless, his shoulders sagging like someone bracing against a tidal wave. He had no strength to resist. Kiana moved toward the table, resting her hand on the back of a chair. The cabin lights cast a soft but resolute glow over her features. "I built Brooks Aviation to be a place where every employee understands the value of integrity," she said calmly. "But today, I realize that integrity hasn't reached the people who needed it most." She looked at Emma, then Jason, then Davis, then each person avoiding her gaze. "This isn't just a professional mistake," she said. "It's a moral one." No one objected. No one pleaded. No one stepped back. Because they all knew, behind her words, was the decision they had been waiting for. And there would be no turning back. Inside the cabin, no one moved. The soft hum of the air system blended with the faint sound of rain outside, forming a thin ambient layer that almost disappeared into the stillness. Yet in that quiet, every gaze was fixed on one person, Kiana. She stood tall, both hands resting on the back of a chair in front of her, as though anchoring herself at the boundary between what had happened and what must happen next. The overhead lighting cast a soft reflection across her cheekbones, highlighting a calm that did not waver. Ethan stepped forward half a pace. "Are you ready to give your conclusion?" There was no hesitation. "Yes." She turned toward the legal team. "Record this." A lawyer immediately set the tablet to audio capture. Jason shifted back half a step. Emma clasped her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. Captain Davis stared at the floor, his face aged by several years in the span of a few hours. Kiana inhaled slowly. First, she began, voice low and steady. I have reviewed the full scope of your actions from the moment I entered the lounge to the footage of me being blocked at the aircraft stairs. No one responded. There is no protocol, she continued, that permits differential treatment based on personal bias. There is no protocol that allows you to judge a passenger solely by appearance. And there is certainly no protocol that forces a paying customer or the leader of this company to stand in the rain for nearly half an hour. Another brief silence, not for effect, but so every syllable could land exactly where it needed to. Jason was the first to speak. Ms. Brooks, if I could have just one more chance. When you saw me, Kiana said, cutting him off, you did not see a passenger. You did not see a partner. You did not see a person. You saw something you believed needed to be controlled. Jason's throat tightened. There was nothing left for him to argue. Kiana turned to Emma. As for you, she said, still calm, you chose to block my path, call security, and refuse to check the manifest, despite repeated requests. Emma trembled. I know I was wrong. I will accept any disciplinary action, but please. You weren't wrong today for the first time, Kiana interrupted. Today is simply the first time you were seen. Emma's head dropped. Her shoulders sank, as though finally collapsing under the weight of everything she had been holding up. Kiana faced Davis next. You were the only one with enough authority to stop this sooner, she said. But you didn't. You stood by and watched. Davis closed his eyes, the words hitting harder than any reprimand. Ms. Brooks, I have no excuse. I can only apologize. When someone has the power to stop wrongdoing and chooses silence, Kiana replied that silence becomes part of the wrongdoing. No one spoke. Ethan straightened his posture, preparing for the final stage. But he knew everyone knew the only person with the right to issue the decision was the CEO herself. And finally, Kiana said, effective immediately. Emma and Jason both tensed, their hands tightening at almost the exact same moment. Emma Roberts is terminated. Not probationary. Not pending review. Effective now. Emma exhaled sharply, like someone releasing a weight so heavy she couldn't believe she had been carrying it. Kiana continued. Jason. Miller is also terminated. Grounds discriminatory conduct, failure to follow protocol, and dishonesty in reporting. Jason bowed his head, lips trembling with no words forming. Not because he didn't want to speak, because he knew nothing he said could undo the reality of his actions. Then Kiana looked at Captain Davis. Mr. Davis, she said, I am placing you on temporary suspension, pending internal review. Not because you insulted me, but because you allowed the insult to occur in your presence. Davis nodded, offering no objection. His eyes met Kiana's, not with resentment, but with a heavy, fair acknowledgement. Finally, Kiana spoke the sentence everyone felt coming before she even said it. Brooks Aviation was not built on my authority. It was built on the value my father taught at the very beginning, respecting every single person who steps onto our aircraft. If that value collapses, no jet is large enough to hide it. Ethan nodded, sealing the conclusion. We will finalize the termination paperwork today. Security will escort personnel out of the restricted area. No one objected. No one asked for more time. No one requested a final word. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. But inside, the silence persisted, as though everyone was standing at the threshold of something from which they could never walk backward. Kiana stepped away from the center of the room. She did not look relieved. She did not look angry. She simply looked steady, like a pilot who has just landed on the runway she knew she needed to face. An ending without theatrics, but truer than any dramatic outburst. And in that moment, everyone understood the reform of Brooks Aviation had just officially begun. The all-staff meeting was held the next morning in the Grand Hall of Brooks Aviation. The early sunlight streamed through tall glass windows, casting long, steady beams across the rows of employees. The atmosphere was unusually quiet, as though the building itself was waiting for something it had never witnessed before. Kiana stepped onto the small stage at the front. No musical intro, no introduction. Only the soft sound of her footsteps on the wooden platform, just loud enough for every head to lift. She stood there, simple calm, and that very calmness radiated something stronger than authority responsibility. "Thank you all for being here," she began. Her voice wasn't loud, nor was it trying to inspire. It was the voice of someone who had thought deeply, very deeply, about what she was about to say. "I will not repeat what happened yesterday," she continued. "Not because I want to forget, but because we have all seen the footage. We all know where the truth lies." The hall fell silent. Some people lowered their heads. Others looked straight ahead, but their eyes held something else: shame, guilt, regret. Not because they had acted wrongly, but because they had been silent. "I am not here to punish," Kiana said. "And I am not here to recount the insults I faced. I am here to ask a very simple question. What kind of company does Brooks Aviation want to be?" She paused long enough for the question to settle into every seat. "We want to be a leader in service," she said, "but no brand is built from airplanes. It is built from people." A chair shifted quietly at the back. Ethan stepped onto the stage, standing beside her without speaking. His presence alone served as a punctuation mark at the end of an important sentence. "Starting today," Kiana said, "we will redefine this company's view of two things: people and ourselves." The room held its breath. First, she continued, "Every one of us will undergo retraining in cultural conduct. Not to memorize procedure, but to learn to pause for 1 second before judging someone." Someone in the back drew in a soft breath. Perhaps they understood this wasn't a message for a few guilty individuals, but for everyone. Second, Kiana said, "We will establish an independent oversight division. They will not report to me. They will not report to the executive board. They will report only to the truth." A few glances shifted across the room, but no one resisted. And finally she said, voice lowering, "We will redefine how we measure success. From this day, Brooks Aviation's success is not judged only by on-time departures or signed contracts, but by how we see each other, hear each other, and treat each other as human beings." She looked across the hall, a gentle look, but one that reached deep. "I do not expect perfection," she said. "I expect courage." Ethan leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Do you want to add anything else?" Kiana shook her head. "No, that's enough." But then she turned back to the audience and said something she hadn't planned. Something that rose from a place deeper than any formal speech could touch. "I still believe in this company." If she had said it louder, it might not have carried as much weight. But because she said it in a near whisper, the entire room focused on it like a vow being spoken into the quiet. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It felt like the moment a runway is illuminated after a long night storm. Kiana stepped off the stage and walked down the front aisle. The employees she passed did not speak, but they stood instinctively. Not out of fear, out of respect. When she reached the hall doors, a voice called out, "Ms. Brooks." Kiana turned. It was Mia, the young employee who had dared to speak up the previous day. She stood in the aisle, hands trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. "I just wanted to say..." Mia swallowed. "Thank you for not giving up on us." In that moment, Kiana's expression softened. She didn't reply with words, she simply nodded. A small nod, but enough for Mia to know her courage had been seen. Kiana stepped out into the hallway. New sunlight poured in, stretching across the tiles like a runway of its own, a runway for a company beginning again, starting today. The doors closed behind her. An old chapter ended. A new chapter opened. And Brooks Aviation, for the first time in years, truly took flight on its own wings. When every door closed and the last light of the day fell across the Westchester runway, Kiana Brooks's story was no longer just the story of a rainy afternoon, or of an aircraft cabin that had witnessed too much in too short a time. If today's story made you pause for a moment, made you think about a certain moment at an airport at work, or in your own life, where someone deserved more respect than they received, share your thoughts in the comments. I always read them. And the stories you leave behind may become a lifeline for someone you may never know. If you believe that values like fairness, dignity, and courage deserve to be shared, please leave a like so this video can reach more people. And if you want to walk with us through the next stories about truth standing up against what is wrong about ordinary people, choosing extraordinary action, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. See you in the next video.